Hello everyone, welcome back to today's video. Now today we're going to be looking at the height and width properties in CSS. So first things first, you open up your code editor as always. Then we're going to get rid of what we did in our previous video, which was padding. Okay, we can leave these values like this. So let's go back to our web page and ensure everything is okay. So now the first element that we're going to be looking at is, or property rather, is the width property. And you can see we've already used the width property here, and we set the width to 300 pixels. Now that is what is making all this text wrap when they get to the end, and not just push it to the end of the page for wrapping. If we comment out this property and note to comment a property or a selected group of text in CSS is you select whatever that text is, or if it's one line, you put your cursor on that line and hit Ctrl / and to be commented. So if you select a group of text and hit Ctrl / it also comments out. So when we save this, you can go back and refresh, and you can see now that the text stretches all the way to the end of the page before wrapping. Now, as the name implies, the width property just gives a defined width to whatever element or class that we are styling. So we've already seen 300 pixels, so if we increase this, you will see that the width also increases. Now in CSS there are different values for this width property. If we type this out again, width, you can see all the different values that we have. So we have auto, we have fit content, max content, min content, and all these other, and there are a lot of them, but we'll be focusing on the most popular ones. Now auto just calculates the default height, and it's dependent on other properties. So in this case, the width auto will be dependent on the text that is inside this property, inside this element. Now this may be different in other cases where you have this nested inside another div. Like if we look at this, and let's go back to this text div. If we cut this now and put it inside another div that has a class name of container, and we copy this class, so save this file, go to our CSS file, and if we put in .container and set a width of, let's say, 400 pixels. Now I'll refresh. Okay, let's add a border around this so that we can really see the effects. We can just add some styling like padding so that it will be separated from the border of the text, and we can add box sizing, border box, so that the width remains 400 pixels irrespective of the padding. So go back and refresh, and now you can see the border of our .container div, and you can see that now the width set to auto is now determined by its parent container and the text inside it. So that's just basically how the auto value works. So now the second value that we saw in the width property is the fit content. So now, just like the name implies, it's the width is set to the content of whatever we're styling. So in this case, this div, the width will be set to the width of this text. So if we go back and refresh, you see that nothing changes and the width is just set to the width of this text. And remember, since this is already inside the div, you also know that it's also dependent on this parent. So if we go back and comment out this parent div and let it just flow all the way, you see that the fit content also works just like the auto value. Another one that we saw was the max content. Now we can just read what this says. Use the max content inline size or max content block size as appropriate to the writing mode. Okay, so what this just basically does, it sets the width to the maximum width of whatever it's inside, of whatever is inside this div or class name. So if you go back and refresh, so this div now should be set to the maximum length of text. So as you can see, the first paragraph or so let's go back and check. So the first paragraph is what determines this width. Well, not the first paragraph, but whatever has a higher width is going to determine this. So if in this second paragraph I add a bit of text, so can go to the end now and say additional text. So because of this, since we've set the width to max content, the width will also be increased because of this. But that is not you will most likely not use that in your website because you don't want your text to be overflowing your page. So the next one that we saw was, I think, the mean content. So let's save this and we'll just run through all these values. So just like the max content, this does the opposite and sets the width to the minimum, to the width of the minimum value in this div. So it takes it to the minimum that it can go without causing problems. So that's it for the semantic values. Now the next ones are going to be looking at the measurement types. So if you look here in these values where we have 0, then the character, we have the percentage, cap, ch, centimeter, and many others. But the most common ones used are, so I can just come here. So the most common values are the percentage, the pixel, the rem, and I guess, let me see, VW. But most times people in web development, percentage and pixel values are mostly used. So for the sake of this, we're going to be looking at the percentage values and pixel values. So we've already seen how the pixel values work just here. So let's see how the percentage works. So now if I set this width to 50% now and go back, what this does is it sets the width to 50% of whatever its parent width is, and not 50% of what the page is. So if we go back to our code now and unmute this commented out parent and refresh, you will see that the width now is set to 50% of our parent div here. So that's just basically how the percentage value works. So the more you increase it, the more of the parent it takes up, and so on. So that's basically how we use the width property to style the size of our divs or whatever you are using it for. And accompanied with the width property, there is also a max width property. Now, just as the name implies, this sets the maximum width that the div or whatever you are styling should go. So if I set the max width of this to 100%, so this will just make sure that the max width of this div should be 100% of its parents. So, and if I set it to something using pixels and I say like 1000, save this and go back, this won't work because it's inside a parents div. So if I go back and mute out this, then save, go back and refresh, you can see that it stretches all the way to 1000 pixels and so on. So most times these values are just dependent on whatever the parent's value is. So we also have the mean width property, and just as the name implies, you can set the minimum width of a div. What you want the minimum width to be can be, so I can set this to, let's say 600 pixels, and if I go back and refresh, now you won't see that implemented here because the text that we have here is very long. But if I mute all this, so let me just mute everything together and recreate that div with some shorter text, like let me say just lorem 10. So we have some shorter text here. If I go back and refresh, you'll see, okay, let's check our styling, and we have the minimum width set to 600 pixels. Okay, so this is because this is a block level element, and we'll get to this later on, but basically block level elements take up the whole width of its parent by default. So if I change this now to display inline block, so look at the display property later on, you'll see now that we have the mean width is set to 600 pixels. So you don't have to worry about this property for now because we'll be looking at this later on in this course. So that's the mean width, max width, and width properties. And now let's move on to the height property. Now the height property has the same, almost like the same thing syntax as the width. So let's look at that. We have height, and for now let's just remove this display so that we don't get confused. Then now we can set the height to, let's set to 100 pixels, save and go back and refresh. So now we have our height set to 100 pixels, and now you can see that this height is not being stretched by the text inside. But now let's look at what happens if our text is more than 100 pixels, or rather our content is more than 100 pixels. So let's still mute the parent and go back and refresh. You can see now that the text overflows the parent's the parent div, and you can see since we set the height of this parent to be 100 pixels, even though this is overflowing the screen, we don't actually get a scroll bar because the parent is not adjusting to the height. Now something like this, if you are, let's say you're building something like with images and you just want a particular part of the image to show and you don't want the overflow to be shown, we can just look at this, and it's known as the overflow property. So you can just set overflow. So we have both overflow y, overflow x, and maybe in later videos we'll look more on this property, but basically you can set it to hidden. Save this, and whatever overflows will no longer be shown. But there are also other values like auto. So what auto does is that whatever the overflow is, it will give you either a scroll bar or not, depending on whatever is overflowing. So, and we can also set it to just scroll by default, and same thing. But just what's the problem with this is that if there is no text to scroll to the left, we just have an invalid horizontal scroll bar, which is not ideal for a user interface. So it's always best to use the auto. So accompanying the overflow property, we also have overflow y and overflow x. And if you're familiar with mathematics, you know that the y-axis is the vertical while the x is the horizontal. So you can set the overflow y to auto, which means you want it to scroll, and you can set the overflow x to hidden, which means you don't want that place to scroll even if there is an overflow. So this is just basically what we get, and we can also set this now to auto and also set this to hidden, and in that case we won't get a scroll bar even if we have text that's overflowing on the y-axis, but we will get a scroll bar if there's text overflowing or content overflowing on the x-axis. So that's just basically it, and don't worry if you don't understand now, we'll look at this later on in this course. So now back to the height property. Just like how the width works, we also have the fit content, we have auto, we have max content, and we have min content. So basically how that works. So we'll just be jumping right to the kind of measurement values that we have. So now with the height property, we have also what we have with width. We have the height, we have the percentage values. So height of 100%, we'll set this to full. So as you can see, we have 100% and it's set to it to contain all content within it. And we also have, we've looked at the pixel property, but there's one special value which is used, and that is known as the VH property, or vertical height. So 100 vertical height, what this just basically says is that the height of this element should be the screen height. So this screen height is defined as from here, from the top of the web tab to the bottom here. So if we refresh, you see that whatever this height is, that is what this div will take up. So if we scroll down, you'll see that we have this. So you can see where the border starts and where it ends. So that's basically what the VH property does. And you can change this from 100, you can set to 10, so to just set to the, you can say like 10% of the vertical height, and basically that's what we have. So And yes, that will be it for this video, and you can play around with the values. And before we go, let's also look at the max and min height properties. So max height, we can set the maximum height to be 500 pixels. Save this, go back and refresh. So okay, 500 pixels actually contains everything. Let's set it to 300 pixels. And now we get this, so let's even set it to something smaller. So or even 150. Now we have a decent overflowing. So something like this is now where you use the overflow properties. So you can use overflow y auto. So let's say I have a div that I don't want it to go more than a certain height to avoid spoiling my layout. I can just use the max height property and just give it overflow of y auto if there's actually content that is overflowing. So we also have, just like we looked at, we have the min height property, and that just basically sets what the minimum height should be, and if there's anything higher than that, it just flows as normal and the height adjusts to that content. So if you refresh now, I set to 1000 pixels, so the div will continue going irrespective of whatever content is in it until 1000 pixels. And if any content is higher than 1000 pixels, the height adjusts automatically. So that's basically it, and I know that this was a lot, but you can just play around with these values and see what you can come up with. You can also test the other values that we saw, because there are a lot of them. So all this, you can test them and see the results they give you. And yeah, that'll be it for this video, and in the next video we should be looking at the display property, just like this, and see what all these values are. And this is a very interesting section in CSS because we get to use things like the flex box and many other things. So see you in that video, and bye for now.